The question we have today has to do with so the formatting of this is a little bit off. It looks really nice on my slideshow, and then I export it to like Keynote, and it's like all really tiny. So that's why it looks that way. But anyway, so this is a question about the Old Testament. So one of the questions is basically like you see often throughout the Old Testament this thing where like people kind of bargain with God, right? They like, for instance, like when Sodom is about to be destroyed, Abraham is kind of bargaining with God. Well, like, what if there's like 50 people in Sodom? Would you destroy it? And then, what if there's like 45 good people in Sodom? Would you destroy it? Right, going all the way down to like 5. If there's 5 good people in Sodom, would you destroy it? And so there's something like that, or like Job seems to kind of bargain with God, right? Like, God, like, why did you do this to me? Kind of getting angry with God. So the question is like, is this kind of a relic of an Old Testament past, or is this something that we should kind of do with God? Do we bargain with God? Do we get angry with God? Do we like talk back to God? Like all these kinds of things are seem like they just are only in the Old Testament.
They're not. It happens every day. Everyone's first a prayer line.
Yeah, well, yeah, and it's possible. So anyway, that's kind of the topic that we're talking about today, and it really gets into one of the most important things here is the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and like what's the relationship between them, because that's a thing that can kind of cause a lot of confusion. So that's one of the things that we're going to focus on today, is the Old Testament. Like, are some of the things that happen in the Old Testament, like what happens there actually applies to us, and then what it kind of just kind of belongs in the Old Testament, and then the New Testament gives us like different things. It's a really interesting and kind of complicated question, but I really like it, so we're going to go over it. Yeah, this is kind of my own answer, and to some extent, I'm not 100% sure about everything, especially about this kind of personal question of like, how do you struggle with God? But I'm somewhat confident, and I think maybe at the very least, us struggling together with it will help us kind of get a better understanding of it. So one of the really key things about like what are testaments? Like we call it the Old Testament and the New Testament. What the heck is a testament, right? So it's a translation of diatheke, which is in Greek means a last will and testament. Sometimes it's used for like a contract. So like before you die, you give your diatheke, you give your last will and testament, or potentially you might like, this is rare, but you might make a contract with someone and you call it your diatheke, right? Now what's awkward here is that the word diatheke is used to translate the Hebrew word for covenant in the Old Testament, right? So, starting around the 300s BC, they started to translate the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek because the Macedonian Empire had come and conquered a whole lot of area. And so since they had been translating it, they come into like certain, right, this is the word that we use to translate this word. And so for whatever reason, they decided to use diatheke, last will and testament or contract, for the word covenant that's used in the Old Testament. And of course, like, this is something that happens in the English all the time. Like, we have like the word shalom or like peace, right? Like, okay, we always translate shalom as peace, but sometimes it might mean something maybe that has a shade of meaning that's a little bit different. And so we have a tradition of calling it peace, but sometimes it might mean something a little bit different, right? So that's kind of the same thing, right? That same dynamic played out in 300 BC as plays out in 2026, right? Kind of crazy. So it kind of became a game of linguistic telephone. So the word berit in Hebrew means like covenant, and they didn't really have a great word to translate covenant, so they used diatheke, or last will and testament, or contract, and then that led us to use the word testament for Old Testament and New Testament. But really, the best way to translate it is something like Old Covenant and New Covenant, because that's kind of the original meaning. This is a really interesting pun that uses this like double meaning of the word testament or diatheke. So can somebody read?
Therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant, diatheke, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed Torah will, diatheke, takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive.
Yeah, so tell me, like, what's the dynamic of the word diatheke in that passage? What makes this, like, a really interesting passage?
Like last will and testament.
Yeah, so it's used for a covenant in the beginning, right? He uses the word diatheke, same word, and then later on he switches to a last will and testament, diatheke, right? So the same word is being used at the beginning as at the end in Hebrews, but our English translations translate it as covenant at first and then last will and testament in the end. So, like, if you're reading this in English, you're like, what the heck is he talking about? You know, like, he starts by talking about a covenant, and now he's talking about last will and testament. Well, what does that have to do with this, like, new covenant, right? But in fact, like, the reason why he starts talking about, like, oh, you need to establish their death before you can have a covenant is because the word diatheke means both things, a last will and testament and also a covenant. And so that kind of dynamic really plays out in the book of Hebrews. And good luck understanding that unless you kind of know, like, the background of it. So the point is not Old Testament versus New Testament, it's Old Covenant versus New Covenant. And that's actually really helpful for us, right? Because in, like, the Old Testament, they talk about, like, okay, so Jeremiah 31, right? There's going to be a new covenant, right, that God has with his people. And you think, okay, that's pretty cool, there's a new covenant. And then you go to the New Testament and you're like, okay, but, like, how do I know the difference between Old Testament, New Testament, all that stuff? Well, it's actually laid out for you in the Old Testament. It's just called New Covenant and Old Covenant. So that means that there's a whole lot of data that is actually relevant to this discussion that you might not recognize if you don't really kind of recognize the Hebrew and Greek kind of roots of it. So what's different between the Old Covenant and New Covenant? So number one, Israel failed to follow the Old Covenant. So it was broken left and right? All throughout the Old Testament, there's Old Covenant. What do we call it? It's a great question. All throughout the Old Testament, there's times where the prophets come and they're like, guys, you're screwing it up, right? You're not following the Torah. You're not, taking care of the poor. You're not taking care of widows. You're not doing all the things that the Old Covenant says that you're supposed to do. So how can you expect that God would be on your side when you're breaking the deal you had with him, right? Like, we had a deal and you're breaking the deal. Maybe that means that God is completely justified in breaking his end of the deal. Now, the interesting part is that, and this is the like marvel of the Old Testament, is that even though Israel keeps on screwing up their end of the deal, God never gives up his end of the deal, which is really kind of the marvel about God's faithfulness to his people, even when they're not faithful to him. So the answer is, so really the Old Covenant was never meant to be intentionally impossible. So this is Deuteronomy 30. This commandment that I command you today, this is at the end of the Torah. Basically, Moses is saying, here's like a summary of the whole Torah, right? This commandment that I command you today is not too hard for you, neither is it far off. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend to heaven for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us, that we may hear from it and do it. But the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so that you can do it, right? So we often talk about the Old Testament as if it was meant to be impossible, like it was meant to show us that we can't follow God. But actually, it was never meant to be intentionally impossible. It's just that we always screw it up. Like, it was never meant to be intentionally impossible. We always screw it up anyway. So the answer is that we just needed a new nature. We needed to be fundamentally changed, and that's what the new covenant needs to bring, right? We need almost like a resurrection. We need to become new people in order to actually follow this, because apparently we've just screwed it up so much, right? The Old Covenant was made with the people of ethnic Israel only. So, at the very beginning of the Old Covenant, right, God appears to Abraham and says, I will be with you, I will bless you, I will make you a great nation, and through you all the nations of the world will be blessed, right? So the Old Covenant really focuses on, you will become a new people, a great nation, right, by yourself. Right, so the Old Covenant was about these people that are the descendants of Abraham, who ultimately will kind of carry the presence of God throughout the world and will become blessed, right? So it's, in some sense, exclusive. It was meant for one specific ethnicity, and the rest of them, we'll get around to them later. But the New Testament, and Paul especially, picks up this idea, right, that in the Old Covenant, right, so he says to Abraham, through you, all the nations of the world will be blessed, and says, okay, that means that eventually, and this is what Jesus did in the end, is we're going to expand this covenant, this deal that God has with Israel to all the nations of the world. So all the nations of the world can come to God through faith. In fact, we see in Romans 4 the idea that, like, okay, what it really means to be a son of Abraham, to be a descendant, to receive the blessings of the old covenant, is to have faith. And he says, like, only those who have faith are the sons of Abraham, are the real sons of Abraham. So there might be ethnic Israelites, right, who have this culture, who even follow the Torah, have this genetic lineage, but they're not really the ones who are the sons of Abraham. It's the ones who had the same kind of faith that Abraham had. Yeah, any questions so far? I kind of feel like I've gone really fast, but sweet. Yeah, somebody read. Somebody read just until it stops, because it comes. Yeah, sorry. Somebody read. Yeah.
Lift up your eyes all around and see. They gather together. They come to you. Your son shall come from afar. Your daughters shall be carried on the hip. Then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall thrill and exult, because the abundance of the sea shall be turned to you. The wealth of the nations shall come to you. A multitude of camels will cover you. The young camels of Midian and Ephah, and all those from Sheba will come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall bring a whole bunch of other stuff.
A bunch of other stuff, including myrrh. So does that remind you of anything? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And so, like, there's a lot of, like, the fact that the wise men brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh is a fulfillment of a lot of things, right? One of the things is that, like, these are things that you use to anoint someone for burial. And there's a sense where, like, we're foreshadowing that a huge part of Jesus' mission is to come and die, right? But another one of the huge parts of why they say golden, frankincense, and myrrh is that it's a fulfillment of this idea that the peoples of all the nations will come and bring gifts to the Messiah, right? To the people of Israel, and in some sense, for Jesus, right? All the nations of the earth come to pay him homage, right?
What passage is that?
Isaiah 61-ish, might be 60. It's like in the 60s. Let me just check that real quick. 60? Isaiah 60, yeah. So really a key passage for understanding the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament is this thing about, like, okay, the Gentiles will come and become a part of this, right? So the same idea, right? This is from Romans 4. This is why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may be guaranteed to all his offspring, not only to the adherent of the law, the person who follows the Torah, which has, like, these like ethnic ideas, right? You need to keep separate from the nations in order to preserve, right, a very specific ethnicity. Because if you just intermarry, if you mix with these other nations, then that very specific ethnicity that's the descendants of Abraham might go away, right? But this, not only to the adherent of the law, but also to the one who shares the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made you the father of many nations. In other words, what God is saying in saying, I've made you the father of many nations, Paul interprets as saying, now he's also the father of everyone who has faith and loyalty to God among all the nations. Crazy, right? Like, this is an explosive argument that Paul is making. In the presence of God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead, he did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, right? So notice what he's saying there, right, is basically that Abraham believed in the resurrection in his own way, right? Abraham believed that God could bring life from the dead. He brought life. He brought a new person out of his body, which was as good as dead. And so what Paul is saying is that the seeds of this new covenant have always existed from the very beginning, all the way back as far as Abraham. And if those seeds have always existed, it's not crazy for us to say that these Gentiles who don't come from this genetic lineage can become fully a part of God's people anyway, right? So his argument is that this has always been the case. I'm not making up anything new. This has been the case since the beginning, since Abraham. The parable of the wedding feast. So this is, so Jesus says, talking about like these people who were invited to this wedding feast in this parable, but they didn't pay him any attention. So they paid no attention and went off, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. His servants there are the prophets. The people he went to are the Jews, right? The king was angry at the king being God, and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. This happened in 70 AD, that the city of Jerusalem was destroyed and was burned by a bunch of troops. Then he said to his servants, "The wedding feast is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main roads and invite to the wedding feast as many as you can." So a lot of people who were genetically part of this lineage rejected the Messiah. And instead, God says, I'm just going to invite everybody, right? If not everybody from this one blessed people is going to come in and be part of this, let's just get them all. Like, bring them all here. The wedding feast is here, and we're just going to have everybody. We're going to have a big party because Jesus is king, and we're going to celebrate that his rule has come. Third, the old covenant had become both too strict and not strict enough. The entire basis on which you rested your relationship with God. So in other words, right, it was too strict, and that was talking about, it had rules for a lot of things, but those rules sometimes had very little to do with whether you pleased God or not, right? So we talk about in the New Testament, right, this idea of like the Sabbath, right? There's like all of these rules that they came up with to decide, okay, what does it mean that we don't work on the Sabbath? And it became like super strict and really ultimately lost the spirit of the whole thing. At the same time, it became not strict enough because people could get the idea in their heads that, okay, as long as we like follow the rules of the Torah or like come up with some creative interpretation of the Torah to say that we were following it even if we weren't really following its spirit, then we're good, right? We just have to do these couple of things, and then for the rest of our lives, like we can just kind of do whatever we want, right? We almost like a taxpayer, right? Like the whole idea of paying your taxes is to do just enough to get the government off your back without having to like give up any more, right? I want to give just this much and no more. That had become kind of what the Torah had become for the Jews in Jesus' day. Is like, okay, we're just going to do this much and no further, right? And so that was another of the problems with the Old Covenant. Yeah, ritualism, right? But the New Covenant set us free to live by the guidance of the Holy Spirit in every area of our lives, right? Somebody want to read?
Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing the king.
Yeah, so what Jesus is saying there is something like, you guys have like these rules about, okay, here's what you tithe. And mint and dill and cumin are like, I'm tithing the fruits of my herb garden outside, right? Like, we don't really do that because that's like absurdly strict. Like, but they're making a show of tithing these tiny little bits of things that they got, right? Like, I pulled off a sprig of mint, so I'll just give one leaf of the 10, to the temple, right? Crazy, right? Meanwhile, they were not taking care of the poor. They were, taking advantage of widows. They were doing all this kind of stuff, which completely went against the spirit of the law, right? At the same time, making a big show of oh, look how righteous I am because I'm giving a little bit of oregano to the temple, right? Because I got to give every tenth of everything I have, right? So Jesus is saying, you strained out a gnat, right? This tiny little thing you managed to follow, but you swallowed a camel. Like, you're being ridiculous, right? And so that's another really main part about why the Torah became no longer necessary for us Christians, because we said, like, well, look, like, we have the Spirit of God on our side, which means not that our lives are less related to God, not that things are less strict, but in fact, it's more strict, because we have to give every part of our lives over to God, not just our little sprig of oregano, So ultimately, Paul says, Israel pursued a law that would lead to righteousness. They did not succeed in reaching that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, by the loyalty to God, but instead as if it were by works, as if it were a matter of paying your taxes, right? I'm going to make the right sacrifice on Saturday so that the rest of my life I can just do whatever I want, right? So what was the point of the Old Covenant? Well, Galatians kind of has an answer, which is basically to preserve a people for God until the coming of a Messiah. They required a law, or Torah, that established customs that separated God's people and kept them holy from the rest of the world, right? So, okay, this is going to be our people, and this is going to be kind of our story of all of humanity, kind of in microcosm, is Israel. So this is from Galatians 4. Basically, the idea is that before, right, we had the Old Covenant, we had the Torah that preserved a people until the Messiah could come. But now, right, this covenant has been expanded to all the nations. So what in the Old Covenant matters to us Gentiles or Old Testament? One, the story of God's people and its fulfillment in Christ. So in other words, the story of God's people started with Abraham. Of course, maybe it started before then, but we know, at least recorded in the Bible for us, that it started with Abraham, and then it spread to all the nations of the world. So that means, as Romans 11 says, like, we have been grafted in. We've now become, even though we were Gentiles, we've been grafted into that story, right? So now the story of Passover is also the story of our forgiveness, of our exile, of our coming home from slavery. Second, teaching about wisdom, justice, and righteousness. So there's tons of stuff in the Old Testament that really matters to us. And, you might come to, like, a new, let's say that you're coming to, like, a new group, and you're, like, let's say it's a board gaming group, right? You might come in and be, like, super, like, excited about these board games, but then you, like, kind of act differently from how everyone else does. And it really helps to have, like, a record of how do people act in this board gaming group, right? Because you're kind of, like, not naturally part of it. Kind of the same idea, right? Like, the Old Testament is the story of God's people. And how do people act in God's people? What kind of wisdom can we learn from how they did act? And what can we learn as far as, like, what did they screw up? Because often we screw up the same things, because we're part of the same people in some sense. Third, the Torah's cultural boundary markers. So cultural boundary markers are like circumcision, keeping the Sabbath, and staying kosher, are all ways that God used to keep the people of Israel separate until the Messiah could come. But those are not binding on us because we don't belong, right, to that culture, right? But they are, in fact, a fascinating and important case study on building a culture based on God's wisdom. So even if we don't necessarily need to know, right, need to follow, like, circumcision, they nevertheless can be helpful for us to understand, like, how do you build a culture based on God's wisdom. Now, what's not different, I don't think the fact that the stories of people bargaining with God are in the Old Testament is relevant, right? I think actually those can be helpful in teaching us how to relate with God, because it really doesn't have anything to do with cultural boundary markers. It doesn't have a whole lot to do with like anything that's very particular to the people of Israel and not to this new covenant. And even if it were, it would be an argument from silence. So the idea that, okay, the New Testament doesn't have people bargaining with God, but the Old Testament does, is what they call an argument from silence, which is an example of a very uncertain argument, because it could just be, right, that people did bargain with God, but it just wasn't recorded, right? That could be an example, right?
All right, wait.
Go ahead.
You're saying you don't think it's relevant that Abraham and Job had conversations with God and there was a dialogue.
I think it's relevant to us. I think the fact that it's in the Old Testament and not in the New Testament is not relevant.
Oh, okay.
So in fact, it's totally, like, useful for us. In fact, I mean, because the Psalms are kind of the same way, right? Like because the Psalms are in the Old Testament doesn't mean that they can't teach us something about how we can worship God, right? Because they don't have anything to do really with the differences between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The main differences are that this is no longer an ethnic difference, right? That all, people from all nations can become a part of this kingdom. And so, yeah, any other questions?
Yeah, it was just the way you worded that.
That was a really poor wording, yes.
You're saying it didn't matter that it was in the Old Testament,
But it does matter for us generally.
still is relevant to us.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, good.
But I was thinking that, I mean, there were times that argument sort of did happen in the New Testament in terms of like, I don't believe that you're Jesus in front of me.
Right.
Kind of thing, like.
Yeah.
And maybe it's because Jesus was present, so if you're gonna argue with anyone, you're arguing with Jesus.
Yeah.
You're not arguing with God.
And honestly, I'm kind of fine, even with, and what we're going to talk about, like what it means to argue well with God. Because there's bad ways of arguing, even in the Old Testament, and there's kind of ways that God is more sympathetic to. And so my opinion is that the Old Testament examples of people bargaining with God can in fact teach us something about how to relate with God, but not all bargaining is good. So there's situations, and we'll talk about those, right, where people bargain with God, and God's like, no, you can't bargain with me. Are you kidding me? Right? And then there's some situations where God kind of entertains it and like allows you to and keeps on talking with you. And so then we can kind of talk about like what's the difference. Now this is also something that I'm exploring personally, and I'm not 100% sure of it. So I think there's a lot of truth in what I'm about to say, but not all of it might be 100% true. And if you would have a perspective that's different, like we can talk about that and think about it, right? Yeah.
Don't worry about that.
Yeah. Okay. So kind of an example from tutoring math, right? When I'm tutoring a student in math, they normally fall into 3 different camps. One is that they already get it. Like it's too easy. Which is cool, right? Like that means I can move on, but it's boring. I would rather that you not get it completely so that I can teach you. Like, that's fun for me,
Well, for being a math tutor, I think there's 4 options.
4 options, just like in the sermon today.
Well, there's 2 different versions of struggling to get it.
Right, yeah, good.
Should be 3A and 3B.
2, there's some people who just pretend to get it, right? They act like they understand, but they don't really, and they don't want to look stupid. And that's really, but that's the problem is like if they pretend to get it, but they don't really get it, there's really not a whole lot of hope for them because they're not really struggling with it to the point that they can actually learn something from it.
Just made me sad.
Yeah, it's okay. The third one is struggling to get it, and will just do whatever I told him to do, so I stop bothering him. Also bad, right? So they're struggling with it, but they're just tired and they just want to give up, right? So that's another one. And then finally, the fourth one, this is like my favorite thing in the whole wide world when I'm tutoring, is a kid that's struggling to get it and goes back and forth, like questions me, that's uncomfortable, and they're not even totally sure that I'm right? So they kind of argue with me, and then they make me convince them that it's true. And that tends to be where most of the learning really happens. Okay, 2 is not the best area. 4 is the best area. So the goal is to get the student to be able to do it on their own. If they just do whatever I tell them to do, or if they like memorize a bunch of steps and they don't know why they work together, they're not going to be able to do it on the test. Because often the test in SAT is like way too diverse and complicated to memorize. Like it's not just like every question is like how long will it take a train to get from New York to Sacramento, right? Like no, like they tend to switch it up so much that if you don't really understand what's going on underneath the problem, then you're not going to get it. So this is called, and this is kind of in learning theory, the zone of proximal development. So there's 3 kind of zones that a person can fall into. So there's the can do it now by themselves, right? So these are the people who are doing a problem and it's just way too easy. And like, why are we wasting our time on this, right? So that's one, and you're not going to learn a whole lot when you're always in your comfort zone and things are super easy for you. There's the people who can't do it at all. Like they're not even close, right? And it's so far above their heads that there's no point in going over it with them because they're never going to get it. And so you need to kind of really build a foundation before you can really start doing this problem with them. And then finally, there's the people who can do it with help, right? This is where you actually are learning, right? So I can kind of like do like half of the steps, but there's like this one step I don't totally get, right? That's the kind of people who have a really good chance of learning something. And in fact, as a tutor, right, that's one of the things I need to like figure out is like, okay, where are they with this problem? Like, is this, which zone does this problem fall into, right? Because if I give someone a problem in one of the, the outside or the middle zone, it's going to be way too easy, and they're either way too easy or way too hard, and they're not going to learn anything. But the middle, that's the sweet spot where they can actually start learning. So in other words, like in every area of life, we are transformed by struggling, by being in that like second zone. Like, because here there's no struggle because it's way too easy. Here there's no struggle because it's way too hard. So we're transformed by struggling. The goal of the gospel is not that we will become God's automata, that we will just be robots that do whatever God wants us to do. It's not about doing what God wants, but instead becoming who God has made us to be. It's about transforming us, becoming different people. And so that has to do with, you have to struggle in order to do that, in order to become a different person. The goal of the gospel is that we would be transformed, that God would rub off on us, and that means if God is rubbing off on us, the more friction, the better, right? You're not going to get a whole lot rubbed off if you're doing like this. But if you're going like this, right, then there's actually potential for transformation.
There'll be some heat.
Yeah, there's going to be some heat, there's going to be some struggle. So for me to be transformed, if the whole point is that I would be transformed, there has to be an I involved. If I just say, okay, God, you just do whatever you want, I'm not going to think about it, but you just do you, and I'm going to kind of leave myself out of it, right? Or maybe I'll just do what you tell me to do, but not think about why you're telling me to do it. Then oftentimes you're not really struggling. You're existing in the can't-do zone here. So God wants our will and our intellect and our thoughts just as much as our hands. And the only way to do that is to actually bring those into bear, into your kind of struggle, you're wrestling with God. Now, one way that we can avoid this is by keeping God at arm's length. So we can say, God is so much wiser than me that I can never understand what he's doing. So why even try, right? I'll just do whatever he wants me to do and not think about it too much. It can kind of become a holy way of saying, it makes me uncomfortable that God acts the way he does. I don't understand and never will, but struggling with God to understand is way too uncomfortable, and I'm never going to do it, right? So that can be just a way of keeping God at arm's length. So I think a relationship with God is a lot like tutoring. So there's some people who already get it, right? They understand God totally. No, there's not. No one totally understands God. So that group of people doesn't exist. Now, there's also people who pretend they get it. They come up with the easiest explanation for anything that God does, and then kind of keep at arm's length anything that might be uncomfortable. Well, that means that they're not really going to struggle to learn and to change with God as much, right? There's some people who will struggle to get it and will just do whatever God tells them to do so that God stops bothering them. And that's great in some ways, right? Because it means that God totally has your hands no matter what. But God also wants your brain and your heart as well, right? And so you have to bring those into your conflict with God. And then there's some people that struggle with God and that argue with God, but nevertheless will go ahead and do what God tells them to do anyway. Right, those people I think have the best chance of having both their heart, hands, and brains changed by their relationship with God. Now, one of the things is that there needs to be trust, right? So if you don't trust God, you're probably not going to be changed by God. In the same way, right, like a student has to trust the tutor in order for there to be actual learning, right? So maybe they could say, right, this tutor is too dumb to answer my question, so there's no point in arguing with them, right? So if that happens, there's not going to be any learning, right? At the same time, if you say something like, this tutor thinks I'm stupid, so I don't want to open up to them at all. Again, there's no trust, and so therefore there's not going to be much learning. On the other hand, if there's a student that really trusts me, that's like, okay, I know that you're probably right, but I don't get it. Like, can you convince me, right? That's where there's often really good learning. So you have to trust God even when you're arguing and bargaining with him for there to be transformation. On the other hand, like there's some times when you're arguing with God and you're like, you actually are wrong, and there's nothing you can do to tell me that and otherwise, right? In that case, you're very unlikely to get transformation. So some examples of good arguing. Abraham, won't the judge of the universe judge rightly? So that's what he says when he's talking to God about Sodom. In other words, he says, okay, I know that you're the judge of the universe, and I know that you're righteous, but the way that you're talking about this doesn't seem righteous to me. So change my mind, convince me, right? That's an example of some good arguing. Or Jacob and Israel, I won't let you go until you bless me. So on the one hand, we have, right, like when Jacob is with Isaac, right, he does this like super crafty way of like stealing a blessing from Isaac. But in this case, right, Jacob has to be like brutally honest with God, right? Like there's nothing I can do to hide what I need. I need this from you, and I need it so badly. I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. That's another good example of arguing with God. The Psalms have all kinds of examples of people arguing with God, bargaining with God, like how, and those can be really good examples for us. And then Job 38-42 is just a big wrestling match between Job and God, right? And it's really helpful to kind of read that and be like, okay, so what did Job do wrong the first time from 38 to 40? And then why was God satisfied in 48 to 42? So that's a homework assignment if you read that. So when we talk about wrestling with God, like the name Israel means wrestling with God. In other words, like that's the people that we have been grafted into. In other words, like that's what we do, right? That's how we learn about God. This is how we're transformed by God. And this is what it means almost to be a Christian, is to be Israel, is to be struggling with God always. So this is a good example of how you might struggle with God. And this is the lament psalm pattern from Psalm 22. So the first thing is my deep, honest feelings about what's happening, right? My God, why are you forsaking me? Why are you so far from saving me? And that doesn't seem very orthodox. It doesn't seem like the kind of thing that you should be able to say, but it's deep inside of your heart, and you need your heart to be transformed by God, which means that you need your heart to actually come into contact with God. The second one is cognitive dissonance. This is, again, from Psalm 22. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel, and you, our fathers, trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued, and you they trusted and were not put into shame. In other words, basically, he's saying, okay, I know this about you, that you're really good, but also it seems like you've forsaken me. How do these connect, right? The same thing with Abraham, right? I know that you're the righteous judge of the universe. Also, you're destroying Sodom. How do these connect? How do we live in this tension? How do we learn something that will make it so that this makes sense? Followed by a personal plea. Yet you are he who took me from the womb. You made me trust you at my mother's breasts. On you was I cast from my birth, and from my mother's womb you have been my God. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, and there is none to help. In other words, the psalmist is totally dependent on God. There's no one else to follow, and that means that he has to be totally honest with God. There's nothing more to do, right? And then that can lead to something like premature praise. In other words, I'm going to praise you now, even when I'm in the midst of the struggle, because I know that you're going to reveal to me what is true, right? So I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. For he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hidden his face from him, but has heard when he cried to him. So the end of that psalm, he's talking in the past tense about something that's going to happen in the future, right? This is the praise that I'm going to give to you, and I'm already praising you for something that you're going to do in the future. Followed by hope. All the prosperous of the earth eat and worship. Before him shall bow all those who go down to the dust, even the one who could not keep himself alive. Posterity shall serve him. It shall be told of the Lord to the coming generation. They shall come and proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn, that he has done it. So there's this great hope that they have for the future, even in the midst of real, huge struggle. Now, there's also examples of bad arguing. So in Jonah, basically something like, God loves me so much that I can manipulate him. So it's very similar to the student who says to their tutor something like, "You're too dumb, and I can't really trust you." Right? Same idea, right? God is too dumb to really be trusted. I can manipulate him however I want. That's really the relationship that Jonah has with God throughout the time. He's basically playing chicken with God. Okay, you can either destroy me or you can destroy Nineveh. There's no other option, right? Those are your two options. And God's like, look, I'm not going to be constrained by this, right? You can go ahead and praise me, or you can just sit alone because I'm not destroying Nineveh, right?
Now,
Or-
your use of the word, those are not scriptural quotes. You put them in quotes, but I think you meant to say
Yeah, sure.
this is a
This is his
paraphrase.
thoughts.
Definitely, but it's definitely the attitude that Jonah had toward God throughout the book, right? Job, something similar, is like, I'll badmouth God when he's not around, but I'm too afraid to answer him face to face. So Job, like all throughout Job we'll call it 3 to 38, right, is badmouthing God, says like, I've been totally righteous and God has been mean to me. This is really messed up, right? And he's talking to his friends and he's saying this, right? But he thinks I'm stupid. It's very similar to he thinks I'm stupid, right? So he talks to God. You should be talking to God and not about God. If you're talking about God and not to God, you're not really wrestling with him. You're kind of keeping God at arm's length and again saying, right, he's not good enough for me even really to wrestle with him. And then Jephthah is in Judges 12, is an example of somebody who makes a vow to God really hastily, right? Says, okay, God, if you do this, I'm going to sacrifice the first thing that comes through the door. And lo and behold, his daughter walks through the door, and so he sacrifices her, right? So he makes this really rash vow to God as like a transaction with no regard to how dangerous God really is, right? Like it is dangerous to wrestle with God, and yet nevertheless, he's safe because he loves us. But if you don't take that danger kind of seriously, then you're not really going to be trying to be transformed. Yeah. So basically, in sum, God doesn't care about your perfection because if you're perfect, you probably aren't being honest. He wants honesty, and without honesty, you will never be transformed because you are never actually coming into contact with God because you are not really part of the equation. So my own experience is that wrestling with God in prayer, including honesty, trust, cognitive dissonance, praise, and hope, have profoundly changed me. Times of suffering have become times when I have nothing to hide myself from God, and I have to wrestle with him. So that means that it's gotten to the point where I need prayer like I need to breathe. There's no other way for me to survive except to pray and to keep on praying and wrestling with God, because otherwise, like, how can I live, right? And ultimately, this is the hope, is that you can say something like Job said, right? I had heard of you by the hearing of my ear, but now my eyes see you. Therefore, I despise or reject myself, maybe, and have changed my mind about dust and ashes. This is my own translation. But basically, in honestly wrestling with God, we can hope to be blessed with a deeper experience of God. Yeah, that's it.